everyone, and thanks for tuning in from wherever you are. My talk is called Art History as a Feature, Non-Dev Skills as a Superpower. I am Tracey Berg-Fulton, and I am a software engineer at Lumen Learning. My happy place is the front of the front end, where I write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and I work on design systems. So that's my standard, hi, I write code bio, but that's terribly incomplete. Because like many people, I had an entire work history before I wrote my first line of code. I was an art historian working in museum collection stewardship, which is basically problem solving with irreplaceable works of art, and answering questions like, how do I get a 10-foot by 30-foot painting across an ocean without it getting damaged? What do you do when the artwork includes a live parrot, and quite a lot of thinking about bugs, light, and water? My very last museum job was as a provenance researcher, which is research into the ownership history of an artwork. And that's a mixture of history, genealogy, library and archival work, and a lot of Googling. But my working life has given me a lot of hats to wear, in addition to the silly Roman soldier hat. I worked as a lifeguard from the time I was 16 until I left graduate school. I've worked in many flavors of retail, and I worked for the Postal Service. But one of the most important side jobs happened when the chair of a museum professional committee called me up and said, "How'd you like to run a website?" And as an early career person, when the chair calls, you generally say yes. So saying yes to that phone call lit the fire for me to learn how to code and led me here today. And I know some of you are thinking that being a software engineer and being an art historian are different things, and you'd be right. But that doesn't mean that they don't support and complement each other. I like to say that art history is a feature in the Tracey code, not a bug in my dev career. The art historian bits of me are just as critical to my work as a dev as my knowledge of JavaScript. So I really want to challenge the idea that the only skills worth valuing or talking about are your coding skills. And we can be pretty sure that we as a community share those, but being a Git wizard isn't all it takes to be good at a job, to be a good coworker, and to be a good community member. Think back to one of your favorite coworkers. Why were they your favorite? When I remember some of my favorites, I don't remember a single piece of their work product, but I do remember how supportive they were of their interns, or how calm they were in a really stressful situation. And those are superpowers learned from life and work experience, and the great news is that we've all got them. So how do we identify our superpowers from our non-dev life, and how do we pull them into our dev career? Well, my first stop for the superpowers is my resume. And a quick note about your resume. If you have a short one-pager that you're using for applications, that's great. For the purpose of this exercise, maybe make just a little supplement that includes some of your really far back jobs and your non-tech jobs. And think about what moments in each of these jobs would make your highlight reel, and what was your role in them. And then put words to those moments. I am good at scheduling. I am good at documentation. I am good at teamwork. I am good at insert thing here. And there's no room for modesty in the superpower world. You've really got to be a little like React and give yourself some props. JavaScript joke? Anybody? Okay. The next question I like to ask when going through my resume is, do these titles reflect what I actually did? And particularly if you're coming from outside of tech or from industries that rely on an institutional title structure, thinking like government and higher ed are kind of prime examples of this, your title may not telegraph your awesomeness, or it may need a bit of an explainer. So be prepared to contextualize those titles. One of the ways I like to do this is by including a common title that reflects what I did, and then my institutional title in parentheses, and you can see two examples here. Or by using bullet points to more clearly spell out the scope of your work if your title doesn't give a clear indicator of what you did. And while we're talking about the work that you actually do, now is the time to think about all the work you do but don't get formal recognition for. Are you an onboarding buddy, a product knowledge source, cake day organizer, tender of the plants? In all of these, there are superpowers, and now's the time to get recognized for them. And as a quick sidebar, I really want to recommend an absolutely smashing talk by Tanya Riley about this sort of work called Being Glue, which you can find at newidea.dog/glue. And then you can also find superpowers by asking your family, friends, former coworkers, and mentors, and they often have a lot of stuff to say. But let's take a quick sidebar here on that topic. When you ask around, people may tell you some things you weren't really prepared to hear. So what do you do with that information? First, I like to take a minute and sit with it, consider their source and their reasoning, and if you ultimately work out that, maybe I do need to work on my scheduling superpower a little bit, Congratulations! You're on the first step of rounding out that superpower. And, sidebar, being able to receive feedback, also a superpower. The second scenario is that they think that you're much better at something than you give yourself credit for. Self-critique is really valuable for folks, but we sometimes struggle to think of ourselves as being good at something. Again, be a little like React, pass those props to yourself. And the third scenario is that they're wrong. And I really don't have a polite way to say this, but people, even people you love and respect, can be wrong. So the key takeaway from this sidebar is that ask for feedback, sit with it, take what's useful, toss out what isn't. So now that we've gathered our superpowers, let's organize them. And I really like to break things down into buckets, but you can call them whatever you like. So when I went through the resume exercise for myself and I identified my superpowers, I kept coming around to 3 buckets or 3 themes. And those were action superpowers, people superpowers, and specialized superpowers. You may have more, you may have fewer, and you can 100% call them different things and give them different labels. So I then went through and put each superpower into one of these buckets. And I really like writing this down because then you have a tangible thing that you can reference in interviews, in performance reviews, or just when you need a reminder that, yeah, you can do hard things. So let's take a look at what some of those buckets actually look like. So my action powers bucket is stuff that I identified this as things that I learned to do in one place, but the doing of that thing is universal and I can take it with me anywhere. So my first one that I came up with was targeting reading and research. In my provenance career, I didn't have time to read a 500-page book cover to cover. So I got really good at looking for the place most likely to have the information I needed, evaluating that information, and bailing if it wasn't there. And as a dev, I don't have time to read the entire spec. So I use that targeted reading and research superpower to find a logical place to start and evaluate the quality and trustworthiness of that information. However, while doing targeted reading and research in Provenance land, I frequently had to use resources in French that pointed to Italian, that pointed to Dutch, and so on. And I am not fluent in all of these languages, but I'm proficient enough to recognize patterns and to use cognates, which are words that sound or are spelled the same and have the same meaning between languages. And in my brain, code feels like another human language. So all I have to do is engage those superpowers, the language superpowers. And just like human languages, programming languages typically share concepts like loops and variables, so that I can use those like cognates to start building out an understanding of an unfamiliar code base. Logical reasoning is another art history skill that comes in handy. When you work on art databases or in provenance, there's a few logical truths you can lean back on. Mainly things like you can't create things before you are born or after you die. It was a great way to run checks and to see where the data we had may need some extra scrutiny and checking. That same logical reasoning and questioning is really important when I write code, and it's also really useful when you're writing tests. And then there's people powers, which are all the skills you've learned in relating to the other humans around you. So working in museum collection stewardship means being in charge when things go really, really wrong in a museum. Some of these things you can plan for in risk management, and that's really another superpower that's very helpful as a developer, but we're not there yet. But there's always going to be a weird situation that pops up, and that's when I like to tap the doing it afraid superpower. Doing it afraid means that I don't 100% know what I'm doing or what the outcome will be, but me and my team are going to do the best we can with the knowledge, tools, and skills that we have. And it's really an invaluable skill for solving dev problems, for troubleshooting, for keeping teammates calm and organized, and for meeting looming deadlines. And while we speak of deadlines, let's talk a little bit about the people skill of being timely. Literally just showing up where and when you said you would with what you said you'd have. That's not a skill I learned in museums, but rather from years of retail. To me, showing up on time or communicating when you're not going to be on time is a demonstration of respect to others and their time and work. And speaking of respect for others, diplomacy is another skill you learn in museum work. Telling an artist that no, they cannot set a fire in a building, no matter how key it is to their creative process, is not an easy conversation. The ability to listen to someone else's concerns, desires, and needs, and then to find a way forward is a superpower that you can use anywhere. So those are skills you can use anywhere. What do you do about the things that you identified that might be super niche? And I'm calling these specialized powers. And I feel like one of the most common ones that maybe a lot of people will have is working with really niche software. For museums, the databases commonly used to track artwork are truly unique and have some quirks about them. And while there may not be KEEMU in my dev job, there's unique software in just about every corner of the world. And being able to wade through that, sit with it, and figure it out, 100% a superpower. So it's not about the software. It's about sitting with the software and figuring it out. Another superpower is knowledge of a particular subculture of the work world. For example, working in museums gave me a grand tour of the operation and politics of nonprofits. When I took a job as a developer at a health nonprofit, that understanding was absolutely invaluable. Yes, museums and health are different, but the way that nonprofit organizations make decisions, gather consensus, work with stakeholders, and who they're accountable to, and also the pace of work was extremely familiar. So I was able to bring some of those nonprofit working skills and, quite frankly, the correct attitude to that work from my museum work. So what do you do when these powers are very specialized? Like, say, being a Zamboni mechanic, and that's my dad. Well, being a Zamboni mechanic means that you've got a problem-solving skill because the thing is broke and it needs to be not broke. And observation skills because you got to figure out how it's broken. And you've got organizational skills because you have to gather all the tools and people and space to make it unbroke. And as well as the ability to diplomatically break bad news to people that the ice maybe isn't getting cleared tonight. It's about thinking about your powers in the round, not about the doing of the thing, but about all of the steps you take to make the thing happen. And I want to take a quick sidebar here and say a thing or two about boundaries. You do not owe an employer or anyone else all of yourself or your superpowers. You're absolutely entitled to keep those things to yourself and actively consent or withdraw consent to using them. And as coworkers and teammates, we should not demand the use of someone else's superpowers without their consent. I'm thinking along the lines of assuming a multilingual coworker will provide free content translations when their paid work is as a developer. How and when you use your superpowers is up to you. And as teammates, we need to be mindful of asking people to do things that are not their job just because we can. Just because they can, rather. Okay, so now know our superpowers, we know how they help us do a dev thing. How do we talk about them in different situations? Particularly if you're early in your dev career and your non-dev work and education are still going to be front and center of your resume, you need to be ready to talk about your non-dev superpowers and why they make you awesome in an interview. And if you've got an interview, they've already clearly seen something special in you that they find interesting and they really want to know more about. So going through the superpowers exercise is a great way to help you answer interview questions like, tell us about a time when something didn't go well and what you learned from it. And to answer these questions, I find it really helpful to think about those buckets and to think about how the buckets of skills go together. For example, it's hard to be an organizer if you're not also a good listener, an action skill plus a people skill. It's hard to hang a 30-foot painting without writing a risk assessment, a specialized skill, and an action skill. And that highlights you as a holistic and unique person who brings a buffet of superpowers to a team, project, organization, and it opens the door for you to talk more about your non-dev experience and how it makes you an awesome developer. And you can talk about and drill down into some of those really esoteric superpowers that you have and highlight the things that you bring to the table. So they've seen how awesome you are, they know all of your superpowers, they've given you the job, and you're happily doing your tech thing. So how can you start leveraging these superpowers for your career path? I usually like to start this conversation in a one-on-one and frame it as, hey, did you know I did this thing in museums which gave me this superpower and I think it could make a real difference in this project. Can I be part of that? Most of the time, you'll get an enthusiastic yes. Every once in a while, someone won't get it. And what do you do when someone doesn't get it, when they don't see the superpower that you bring to your dev work? And if you're experiencing this in the workplace, my first strategy is persistence. So I basically bring it up at every chance I get, using statements that frame that experience as an asset. Oh yeah, I used to have to do these massive data imports in my museum job, where we did X, Y, and Z, and I think that might help us here. If you're encountering this attitude in the hiring process, I feel like that is a giant flashing red flag that maybe you don't want to work for that employer. Sometimes this might show up as additional code testing that's outside of the normal interview process or outside of the process that was highlighted to you. Hostile interviewing, and occasionally just like absolute outright disdain. But I do want to stress that this is thankfully a small, tiny speck on the landscape. And quite frankly, I don't really want to work for or with anyone who has such a narrow view of what makes a dev. But I do want to put it out there that that exists, but it is thankfully a tiny speck of the world. But what I do hope is that as more of us superpower holders come into our own as devs, and as we move on, that we continue to recognize and encourage non-dev superpowers in others on our team, enable them to grow and thrive as whole beings in addition to devs, and to highlight those superpowers that they have. So, to wrap up, thank you once again for your time. Again, I am Tracey Berg-Fulton. You can please feel free to reach out to me on CodeNewbie or on Twitter, where I live as Berg-Fulton.